In the sprawling mansion overlooking Lake Geneva, silence had become Thomas Richardson's closest companion. The tech mogul who once commanded boardrooms filled with hundreds now spoke mainly to empty hallways and the hum of surveillance cameras that watched his every move. But on this particular October morning, as frost kissed the manicured gardens and the grandfather clock chimed 7, Thomas discovered something that would shatter his carefully constructed isolation forever. Hidden in the library's oak desk drawer, beneath financial documents and patent applications, lay a small digital recorder still warm to the touch. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The red light blinked steadily, capturing words he never intended anyone to hear. What his longtime housekeeper Sarah had been documenting in secret wasn't theft or corporate espionage, but something far more devastating. She had been recording the sound of a man slowly disappearing into his own grief. The Richardson estate stretched across 47 acres of pristine Connecticut countryside, a testament to the fortune Thomas had built from nothing more than code and ambition. At 45, he was younger than most men who commanded such wealth, but the silver threading through his dark hair and the deep lines around his green eyes told the story of someone who had paid a heavy price for success. The mansion itself, a Georgian revival masterpiece completed just 3 years prior, had been designed with one woman in mind. Every marble countertop, every crystal chandelier, every hand-painted mural had been chosen to please someone who would never see the finished result. Caroline Richardson had died in a car accident 6 months before the house was completed, leaving behind architectural plans, fabric samples, and a husband who couldn't bring himself to change a single detail of her vision. Now, 2 years after her death, the house stood as a monument to a love story cut short, inhabited by a man who moved through it like a ghost haunting his own life. Thomas had let most of the staff go in the months following Caroline's funeral. The groundskeepers came twice weekly, the pool maintenance crew monthly, but inside the vast house, only one person remained from the original team. Sarah Mitchell had worked for the Richardsons since before they were married, back when Thomas was still building his software empire from a cramped apartment in Stamford. She had watched their love bloom, had helped Caroline plan every detail of their dream home, and had been the one to hold Thomas when he collapsed at the funeral. At 62, Sarah possessed the kind of quiet strength that comes from decades of service, not subservience, but genuine care for the families whose lives she helped manage. Her silver hair was always pulled back in a neat bun, her uniform pressed and professional, but her brown eyes held warmth that no amount of tragedy could extinguish. She had raised 4 children of her own while working for 3 different families, and she understood the rhythms of grief in ways that most people never would. The morning Thomas found the recorder began like all the others had for the past 18 months. He woke at dawn in the master bedroom he could no longer bear to sleep in, emerging instead from the study where he'd fallen asleep at his desk again, surrounded by work he no longer cared about. His company, Richardson Technologies, practically ran itself now thanks to the capable executives he'd hired and the systems he'd built, but Thomas maintained the pretense of involvement, reviewing reports and attending video conferences from his home office. Sarah arrived at 7:30, as she had every weekday for the past decade. She let herself in through the service entrance, hung her coat on the designated hook, and began her morning routine. Coffee first, brewed strong the way Thomas preferred it, though he rarely drank more than half a cup anymore. Then she would assess what needed attention throughout the house, creating a mental list of tasks that would occupy her until late afternoon. The house was immaculate, almost museum-like in its perfection. Sarah's cleaning was more maintenance than necessity, dusting surfaces that saw no use, arranging flowers in rooms Thomas never entered, maintaining the illusion that life continued within these walls. She had tried, in the early months after Caroline's death, to suggest changes. Perhaps they could convert Caroline's craft room into something else, maybe donate her extensive wardrobe to charity, or at least remove some of the more painful reminders scattered throughout the house. But Thomas had refused every suggestion with the quiet desperation of someone clinging to wreckage in a storm. So Sarah adapted, becoming the keeper of a shrine disguised as a home. She maintained Caroline's garden exactly as it had been left, rotating the fresh flowers in Caroline's favorite vases, even keeping the artistic supplies in the sunroom organized just the way Caroline had liked them. It was heartbreaking work, but Sarah understood that grief had its own timeline, and her job was not to hurry healing but to create space for it when it finally came. The recorder had belonged to Caroline originally, a professional-grade device she'd used for documenting her design ideas and recording notes for the contractors building their dream home. Sarah had discovered it in Caroline's craft room months after the accident, forgotten behind a stack of fabric samples. She had meant to give it to Thomas, but something had stopped her. Instead, she had held onto it, and eventually she had begun using it herself. It started innocently enough. Sarah would speak into the device while working, voicing observations about the house, reminders about maintenance schedules, thoughts about meals she might prepare for Thomas. But gradually, her recordings had evolved into something more personal. She found herself documenting not just the physical state of the house, but the emotional atmosphere within it. She recorded her concerns about Thomas's increasing isolation, her observations about his deteriorating health, and her growing worry that the man she had watched build an empire was slowly fading away. Sarah told herself she was keeping these recordings for practical reasons. If something happened to her, if she fell ill or could no longer work, perhaps they would help whoever replaced her understand the delicate ecosystem of grief and routine she had created. But deep down, she knew the truth was more complex. The recordings were her way of bearing witness to a tragedy that had no audience, of ensuring that someone somewhere understood what was happening to Thomas Richardson behind the closed doors of his perfect house. Thomas discovered the recorder by accident. He had been looking for a contract related to the house's original construction, something his lawyers needed for an insurance claim. Sarah was upstairs changing linens, and Thomas was searching through the desk drawers when his fingers brushed against the small device. He pulled it out, puzzled, recognizing it as Caroline's old recorder, but surprised to find it still warm, obviously recently used. Curiosity overcame discretion. Thomas pressed play, expecting to hear Caroline's voice from years past, perhaps some forgotten design notes that would bring both pain and comfort. Instead, he heard Sarah's voice, speaking quietly but clearly into the microphone. Day 412, Sarah's voice emerged from the tiny speaker. Thomas didn't come down for breakfast again. I left a tray outside the study, but when I checked this afternoon, the food was untouched. He's lost more weight. I can see it in his face, in the way his clothes hang on his frame. I'm worried he's forgetting how to live. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. He pressed pause, staring at the device as if it might explain itself. Sarah had been recording him. For how long? What else had she documented? A mixture of anger and violation surged through him, followed quickly by something else, a desperate curiosity about how he appeared through someone else's eyes. He pressed play again. I found him sleeping at his desk again this morning, his head pillowed on financial reports. The computer was still running, showing the screensaver Caroline had chosen, the one with their wedding photos cycling endlessly. I wanted to wake him, to insist he sleep in a proper bed, but I've learned to pick my battles. Sometimes I think the desk is the only place he can rest, because it's the only room in the house that doesn't echo with memories of her. The recordings continued, each entry marked with a date and Sarah's quiet observations. Thomas fast-forwarded through several, his hands shaking slightly as he heard his own life narrated back to him through the eyes of someone who had been watching, truly watching, all along. He's been talking to himself more frequently. Not conversations exactly, just fragments of sentences, as if he's trying to finish discussions he and Caroline never got to complete. Yesterday I heard him in the kitchen, saying something about the trip to Italy they had planned. He was standing at the counter, holding 2 coffee cups, and I realized he had poured coffee for her out of habit. When he noticed what he'd done, he stood there for nearly 10 minutes, just staring at the extra cup, like it might explain why she wasn't there to drink it. Thomas sank into the leather chair behind the desk, the recorder clutched in his hands. Sarah's words painted a picture of a man he barely recognized, someone pitiable and lost, someone who had become a subject of study, rather than a person commanding respect. The anger he had felt initially was replaced by something more complex, a mixture of embarrassment and recognition. The man Sarah was describing was indeed who he had become, but hearing it articulated so clearly was both shocking and strangely relieving. "I've been researching grief counselors in the area," Sarah's voice continued from a recording dated 3 weeks earlier. "Not because I think he would go willingly, but because I need to understand what I'm witnessing. The books talk about stages of grief, but what they don't explain is how someone can get trapped between stages, suspended in a state that's neither denial nor acceptance, but something else entirely. Thomas has built a world where Caroline is both completely gone and perpetually present, and I don't know how to help him find his way out." The entries revealed a level of attention and care that Thomas had never realized. Sarah documented not just his behavior, but her own responses to it. She recorded her frustration when he refused meals she had carefully prepared, her sadness when she found him holding Caroline's clothes, her quiet celebrations when he showed small signs of engagement with the world. The recordings painted a picture of two people living in the same house, but experiencing completely different versions of reality. "Today was one of the better days," Sarah's voice said from a recording dated just a week ago. "Thomas actually came to the kitchen while I was cooking. He didn't say much, just asked what I was making, but he lingered there for almost 15 minutes, watching me work. I think he was remembering Caroline in that space."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"She used to love to cook with me, especially when they were first married, and she was learning her way around such a large kitchen. For a moment today, I saw a flicker of the man he used to be, the one who would laugh at Caroline's attempts to flip pancakes and tell stories about his childhood while she cooked. But then the phone rang, something about business, and he retreated to his study like a hermit crab pulling into its shell." Thomas realized he remembered that morning. He had come to the kitchen because the smell of Sarah's cooking had reminded him of Sunday mornings when Caroline was alive, when they would spend lazy hours cooking elaborate breakfasts and reading the newspaper together. But he hadn't understood that his presence there had been significant to Sarah, or that his retreat had been so obviously painful to witness. The recordings revealed layers of household management that Thomas had never considered. Sarah didn't just clean and cook, she maintained the emotional temperature of the house. She documented her strategies for dealing with his mood swings, her careful attention to the triggers that would send him deeper into isolation, her subtle attempts to draw him back into engagement with life. "I've started playing classical music in the mornings, the same pieces Caroline used to favor. Not loudly, just soft background music that drifts through the house. Thomas hasn't said anything about it, but I've noticed he stays downstairs longer when the music is playing. Yesterday he even hummed along to a piece by Chopin, probably without realizing it. Caroline always said music was the language of memory, and I think she was right. The melodies seem to reach parts of him that words cannot touch." Thomas pressed pause, his throat tight with emotion he couldn't name. He did remember the music, had even found comfort in it, but he had assumed it was just Sarah's preference. The idea that she had chosen those specific pieces, that she was consciously trying to create connections to Caroline and to happier times, revealed a level of thoughtfulness that was both touching and overwhelming. He fast-forwarded again, looking for more recent entries, and found recordings from just days before his discovery. Sarah's voice sounded more concerned, more urgent than in the earlier entries. "Thomas had visitors today, business associates from the company. I served lunch in the dining room, the first time that room had been used in over a year. I watched him during the meeting, and it was like seeing someone play a part in a theater production. He smiled at the right moments, asked appropriate questions, projected the image of a successful executive in control of his empire. But his eyes were empty, and the moment the visitors left, he collapsed back into himself like a balloon losing air. The performance exhausted him so completely that he didn't emerge from his study for the rest of the day. The recording continued with Sarah's analysis of what she had witnessed. "I think Thomas has become two people. The public figure who can still function in the business world, and the private man who is drowning in grief. The energy required to maintain that split is unsustainable. I can see the toll it's taking on his health, his sleep, his ability to connect with reality. I'm afraid of what will happen when he can no longer manage the performance." Thomas found himself leaning forward, absorbed in Sarah's assessment of his own life. She saw through the facade he had thought was impenetrable, understood the exhausting effort required to appear normal in professional settings. He had never realized that his performance was so transparent to someone watching from the outside. The next recording was dated just 2 days before Thomas found the device. Sarah's voice sounded different, more emotional than in previous entries. "I made a mistake today." Thomas was in Caroline's craft room, sitting in her chair holding one of her unfinished projects. He looked so broken, so completely lost, that I couldn't help myself. I went to him and put my hand on his shoulder, tried to offer some comfort. He didn't pull away, but he started crying, really crying for the first time since the funeral. I held him while he sobbed, and for a few minutes I thought perhaps we had turned a corner, that the grief was finally beginning to move through him instead of just accumulating inside him. Sarah's voice paused on the recording, and Thomas could hear her taking a shaky breath before continuing. But then he pulled away, apologized for the display of emotion, and asked me to leave him alone. When I came back an hour later, he had locked the door to the craft room. I think my attempt to comfort him felt like a betrayal somehow, as if I was trying to replace Caroline's role in his life. That wasn't my intention, but I understand how it might have seemed that way to him. I've been so focused on taking care of him that I forgot the most important rule of grief. It has to be experienced alone, even when you're surrounded by people who love you. Thomas remembered that afternoon with painful clarity. He had been overwhelmed by the kindness in Sarah's touch, by the evidence that someone still cared enough to comfort him. But the comfort had felt like a betrayal of his loyalty to Caroline, as if accepting solace meant accepting that she was truly gone. He had pulled away not because Sarah had done anything wrong, but because he wasn't ready to be comforted, wasn't ready to take any step that might lead him away from the raw grief that had become his closest connection to his deceased wife. The final recording on the device was dated the day before Thomas discovered it. Sarah's voice was quiet, reflective, tinged with sadness and resolution. "I've been caring for Thomas for almost 2 years now, and I'm beginning to understand that my presence might be enabling his retreat from life, rather than helping him heal. By maintaining this house exactly as Caroline left it, by accommodating his need to live as if she might return at any moment, I may be preventing him from moving through his grief towards something resembling acceptance. It's a terrible realization because everything I've done has been motivated by love and concern, but I'm starting to think that love sometimes requires difficult choices." Sarah paused on the recording, and Thomas could hear her moving around, perhaps organizing papers or completing some household task while she spoke. "I've been thinking about giving my notice, about forcing Thomas to confront his isolation by removing the one person who makes it possible for him to avoid the world. It would be the hardest thing I've ever done, leaving him when he needs support, but I'm beginning to think it might also be the most loving. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is refuse to help them hide from their own life." The recording ended there, leaving Thomas staring at the silent device in his hands. The revelation that Sarah had been considering leaving hit him harder than anything else he had heard. He had taken her presence for granted, assumed that she would continue to manage his household and accommodate his grief indefinitely. The idea that his behavior had pushed her to consider abandoning him was both shocking and illuminating. Thomas sat in the study for hours, replaying sections of the recordings and trying to process what he had learned. Sarah's documentation revealed not just his own deterioration, but the impossible position he had put her in by retreating so completely from life. She had become the keeper of a museum of grief, maintaining a shrine to Caroline, while watching the surviving husband slowly disappear. The recordings also revealed Sarah's deep understanding of the situation. She wasn't just a housekeeper going through the motions, she was someone who had studied grief, researched ways to help and made countless small decisions designed to support his healing. Her choice of music, her careful attention to his eating habits, her subtle attempts to engage him in conversation, all of it had been purposeful and thoughtful in ways he had never recognized. As the afternoon light began to fade outside the study windows, Thomas finally understood the full weight of what Sarah had been carrying. She had been bearing witness to his grief not as a passive observer, but as someone who cared enough to document the journey, to track his progress and setbacks, to maintain hope even when he had abandoned it entirely. The recordings were not a violation of his privacy, but a testament to her commitment to his well-being. The anger he had felt upon first hearing the recordings had completely dissipated, replaced by something more complex. He felt gratitude for Sarah's attention and care, embarrassment at how his behavior appeared from the outside, and a growing awareness of how much he had asked of her without ever acknowledging the burden. Most surprisingly, he felt a flicker of curiosity about his own capacity for change. If Sarah could see him so clearly, perhaps she could also help him see a way forward. Thomas heard Sarah's footsteps in the hallway, her familiar pattern of movement as she completed her afternoon tasks. He realized she would be leaving soon, returning to her own small apartment in town, and tomorrow she would arrive again to care for a man who had given her little reason to hope for improvement. The thought of her going home each day to wrestle with the decision of whether to continue working for him, whether to enable his retreat from life, or force him to confront it, was more painful than any of the direct observations she had recorded about his behavior. He looked around the study, seeing it for perhaps the first time through Sarah's eyes. The desk covered with work he barely engaged with, the couch where he slept instead of facing the bedroom he had shared with Caroline, the walls lined with awards and accomplishments that no longer held any meaning for him. It was the room of someone who had stopped living while continuing to exist, someone who had turned grief into a full-time occupation. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 5 times, signaling the end of another day in the endless series of days that had followed Caroline's death. Thomas heard Sarah gathering her things, preparing to leave him alone with his carefully maintained sorrow, but for the first time in months, the prospect of solitude didn't bring relief. Instead, he felt something he hadn't experienced since Caroline's funeral, the desire to connect with another human being, to step outside the prison of his own grief and acknowledge the world that continued to exist beyond his loss. Thomas stood up from the desk, the recorder still in his hands, and walked toward the door of the study. Sarah's footsteps were moving toward the service entrance, following the same pattern she had maintained for months. He quickened his pace, suddenly desperate to catch her before she left, before another day passed without acknowledgement of what she had been doing for him, before the distance between them grew so vast that it could not be bridged. As he rounded the corner into the hallway, Thomas saw Sarah putting on her coat, her movements efficient and familiar. She looked up as he approached, her brown eyes showing surprise at his sudden appearance outside the study. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of everything documented on the recorder hanging in the air between them. Thomas realized he was holding the device openly, making no attempt to hide his discovery, and Sarah's eyes moved to it with understanding and perhaps relief. The silence stretched between them, filled with 2 years of unspoken observations, documented concerns, and carefully maintained boundaries.
Thomas felt the weight of everything he had never acknowledged, every meal Sarah had prepared, and he had ignored, every attempt at conversation he had dismissed, every small kindness he had accepted without gratitude. The recordings had shown him not just his own retreat from life, but Sarah's patient, persistent efforts to create bridges back to the world of the living. Sarah stood quietly, waiting for him to speak,
her expression patient but guarded. Thomas realized she had probably been expecting this confrontation since she first started making the recordings, had perhaps even hoped for it as a way to break through the wall of isolation he had built around himself. The recorder in his hands represented not just her documentation of his grief, but her refusal to let him disappear completely, her insistence on bearing witness to his struggle even when he had given up witnessing it himself. The afternoon light slanted through the tall windows of the hallway, illuminating the space between them like a stage where something significant was about to unfold. Thomas felt the familiar tug of retreat, the desire to return to his study and avoid the complexity of human connection. But Sarah's words echoed in his mind. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is refuse to help someone hide from their own life. He realized that this moment represented a choice, not just for him but for both of them, about whether to continue the patterns that had sustained his grief or to risk the unknown territory of healing. As Thomas looked at Sarah's face, he saw not just the housekeeper who had maintained his household, but someone who had chosen to care about his well-being when he had stopped caring about it himself. The recordings had shown him that he had not been alone in his grief, that someone had been paying attention, keeping track, hoping for change even when change seemed impossible. The question now was whether he had the courage to acknowledge that attention and begin the difficult work of earning it. The conversation that followed Thomas's discovery of the recorder stretched long into the evening, unfolding in layers of revelation that neither of them had anticipated. Sarah stood in the hallway, her coat half-buttoned, watching as Thomas turned the small device over in his hands like a puzzle he was trying to solve. The grandfather clock continued its steady rhythm, marking time in a house where time had seemed suspended for so long. "How long have you been recording?" Thomas finally asked, his voice hoarse from disuse and emotion. Sarah straightened her shoulders, meeting his gaze directly. 8 months, she replied. "Since the day I found you unconscious at your desk, surrounded by Caroline's photographs. You'd been there for almost 14 hours, and I couldn't wake you properly. I realized then that someone needed to be paying attention, really paying attention, to what was happening to you." Thomas felt a flush of embarrassment as he remembered that morning. He had been going through boxes of Caroline's belongings, sorting through memories until exhaustion overtook him completely. When Sarah had finally roused him, he had dismissed her concerns and retreated even further into isolation, but apparently his withdrawal had only strengthened her resolve to document what she was witnessing. "You said in the recordings that you were thinking about leaving," Thomas said, the words catching in his throat. "Are you planning to quit?" Sarah removed her coat slowly, hanging it back on the hook by the door. The gesture seemed to signal that the conversation would not be brief, that they had crossed some threshold from which there would be no easy retreat. "I've been wrestling with that decision for weeks," she admitted. "Not because I want to abandon you, Thomas, but because I'm afraid my presence is making it easier for you to avoid dealing with your grief. I've been enabling your isolation by making it comfortable, by ensuring you never have to face the consequences of withdrawing from life." They moved into the living room, a space that had gone largely unused since Caroline's death. Sarah switched on lamps, bringing warmth to the room that had been shrouded in darkness for months. Thomas settled into one of the leather chairs, while Sarah chose the sofa where Caroline used to curl up with her design books in the evenings. "The recordings weren't meant to violate your privacy," Sarah continued. "They started as a way for me to process what I was seeing, to try to understand grief in a way that might help me help you. But they became something else, a chronicle of someone I care about slowly disappearing." Thomas listened as Sarah explained her motivation in more detail than the recordings had captured. She spoke about the research she had done into complicated grief, about the consultations she had sought with counselors and social workers, about the nights she had lain awake worrying that she would arrive at work to find he had harmed himself. The depth of her concern and the extent of her efforts to understand his condition were overwhelming. "You've been studying me,"
Thomas said, not accusingly, but with wonder, like I was a case study. Not a case study, Sarah corrected gently, like you were someone whose life mattered to me. Someone whose well-being had become my responsibility, not because of my job, but because of who you are and what you've been through. As the evening progressed, Thomas found himself talking more than he had in months. Sarah's recordings had created an opening, a way to discuss his behavior and emotions without the usual barriers of pride and denial. He told her about the dreams that haunted his sleep, where Caroline appeared so vividly that waking felt like losing her all over again. He described the mornings when he would forget, for just a moment, that she was gone, and would turn to share some thought or observation only to face empty space. Sarah listened without judgment, occasionally offering observations from her recordings that provided context for behaviors Thomas himself hadn't understood. When he mentioned his inability to sleep in the master bedroom, she reminded him of the night she had found him standing in the doorway, talking to the empty room as if Caroline might answer. You were asking her opinion about a business decision, Sarah recalled. Standing there in your pajamas at 3 in the morning, laying out the pros and cons of some acquisition, as if she was sitting on the bed listening. When you noticed me in the hallway, you looked so embarrassed, but I thought it was beautiful in a way. You were still including her in your life, still valuing her input even though she couldn't respond. The conversation revealed layers of grief that Thomas had never articulated, even to himself. He talked about his guilt over the accident, even though he hadn't been driving and couldn't have prevented it. He described his anger at Caroline for leaving him, an emotion so shameful he had buried it beneath layers of idealization and longing. Most painfully, he admitted his fear that moving forward with his life would mean betraying their love, that healing would require him to diminish the importance of what they had shared. Sarah's responses were informed by months of observation and research. She had insights into his patterns of behavior that illuminated aspects of his grief he hadn't recognized. She pointed out his tendency to punish himself for moments of happiness or normalcy, the way he would retreat into deeper isolation whenever he caught himself enjoying something or feeling momentarily at peace. You've been treating joy like a betrayal, Sarah observed. As if allowing yourself to feel good about anything would dishonor Caroline's memory. But I don't think that's what she would have wanted for you. As they talked, Thomas began to see his behavior through Sarah's eyes. The man she had been documenting was not just grieving, he was actively preventing himself from healing, creating obstacles to recovery, and then using those obstacles to justify his continued suffering. The recordings had captured not just his decline, but his unconscious resistance to any progress toward acceptance or peace. The conversation stretched past midnight, breaking patterns of interaction that had been established for months. For the first time since Caroline's death, Thomas was fully present in a conversation, engaged with another person's perspective, considering possibilities beyond his current state of suspended grief. Sarah had created space for this dialogue through her careful documentation, her patient observation, and her willingness to risk confrontation in service of his well-being. As the night deepened, they moved beyond discussion of his grief to broader questions about his life and future. Sarah had documented his gradual disconnection from his business interests, his withdrawal from friendships and social obligations, his increasing isolation from anything that might provide meaning or purpose beyond his mourning. She had also noted moments of engagement, brief glimpses of the man he had been before tragedy reshaped his existence. You still care about the company, Sarah said. I can see it in the way you respond to certain calls, the attention you pay to particular reports. You're not as detached from that part of your life as you pretend to be. Thomas considered this observation. Richardson Technologies had been his passion long before he met Caroline, the vehicle through which he had built his fortune and established his identity. He had assumed that his indifference to the business was permanent, another casualty of his loss, but Sarah's recordings suggested otherwise. Caroline used to worry that I was too absorbed in work, Thomas said slowly. She wanted me to have interests outside the company, hobbies and friendships that weren't connected to business. After she died, I felt guilty about every minute I spent thinking about anything other than her, including work that had once consumed me. Sarah nodded, consulting notes she had brought from her recordings, but she also understood that your work was part of who you were. I remember her talking about the pride she felt when you solved particularly challenging problems, how excited she would get when you explained new innovations you were developing. She didn't want you to abandon your ambition, she wanted you to have balance. These conversations continued over several days, establishing a new dynamic between Thomas and Sarah. The discovery of the recordings had shattered the careful boundaries they had maintained, forcing them to acknowledge the depth of their relationship and the extent to which Sarah had become invested in Thomas's recovery. No longer could they pretend that she was simply a housekeeper and he was simply an employer. The recordings had documented a level of care and concern that transcended professional obligations. Thomas found himself looking forward to these discussions, planning questions to ask Sarah about her observations and insights. For the first time in months, he had a reason to engage with another person, something to think about beyond his own loss and regret. Sarah, for her part, seemed relieved to be able to speak openly about what she had been witnessing and her concerns about his well-being. The recordings became a tool for their conversations, a way to examine specific incidents and behaviors with the objectivity that documentation provided. Thomas would listen to Sarah's observations about particular days or periods, then offer his own perspective on what had been happening internally during those times.
The process was sometimes painful, but always illuminating, creating a more complete picture of his grief and its impact on his daily life. One recording that particularly struck Thomas was Sarah's documentation of his relationship with food and basic self-care. She had tracked his weight loss, his tendency to skip meals, his gradual neglect of personal hygiene and grooming. The data she had collected painted a clear picture of someone whose grief had disrupted even the most fundamental aspects of living. "I was disappearing," Thomas said after listening to several entries about his declining physical condition. "Not just emotionally, but literally. I was letting myself waste away." Sarah had documented her own responses to his deterioration, her attempts to encourage better habits, her frustration when those attempts failed. She had researched nutrition for people experiencing depression, had consulted with Caroline's former physician about warning signs to watch for, had even prepared meal plans designed to support both physical and emotional recovery. "I felt like I was watching someone I cared about commit slow suicide," Sarah said, "not through any dramatic gesture, but through neglect and withdrawal. It was terrifying because I didn't know how to intervene without overstepping my bounds." These revelations led to practical changes in Thomas's daily routine. Knowing that Sarah had been tracking his eating habits and sleep patterns motivated him to pay attention to these basic needs. He began joining her in the kitchen during meal preparation, initially just to continue their conversations, but gradually becoming involved in the process of cooking and eating regular meals. Sarah had also documented Thomas's relationship with the physical space of the house, noting his avoidance of certain rooms and his tendency to retreat into increasingly smaller areas. The master bedroom had been abandoned completely. Caroline's craft room was visited only during moments of intense emotional crisis, and even the main living areas had been largely unused. Thomas had been living in a progressively smaller portion of the house he and Caroline had designed together. "You were creating a shrine," Sarah observed, "preserving everything exactly as Caroline left it, but not actually engaging with those spaces in any meaningful way. The house became a museum to your marriage, but museums are for dead things, and your love for Caroline isn't dead." This insight prompted Thomas to consider his relationship with Caroline's belongings and the spaces they had shared. The recordings revealed that his preservation of everything exactly as she had left it was not honoring her memory but freezing it,
preventing the natural evolution of grief that might allow him to maintain connection to Caroline while still engaging with life. Over the following weeks, Thomas began small experiments in reclaiming parts of the house. With Sarah's support, he started using the main living areas again, not to replace memories of Caroline but to create new experiences that could coexist with those memories. They had conversations in the library, where Caroline used to read, shared meals in the dining room where she had entertained friends, gradually reactivating spaces that had been sealed off by grief. The recordings also revealed the extent to which Thomas's isolation had affected his relationships beyond the household. Sarah had documented the phone calls he had avoided, the invitations he had declined, the gradual withdrawal from professional and social connections that had once provided meaning and support. Friends and colleagues had initially been patient with his grief, but as months stretched into years, many had stopped reaching out, creating an isolation that was both chosen and imposed. People want to help, Sarah noted during one of their conversations, but they don't know how to maintain connection with someone who consistently refuses engagement. Your withdrawal has created a cycle where others stop trying, which reinforces your belief that you're alone in your grief. Thomas began to recognize patterns in his behavior that he had never consciously acknowledged. The recordings showed him how he had used his grief as a shield against any experience that might threaten his connection to Caroline, including experiences that might have provided comfort or support. He had trained himself to find reasons to reject overtures of friendship, to avoid activities that might bring joy, to resist any change that might suggest he was moving beyond his loss. Sarah's documentation had also captured his complicated relationship with his business responsibilities. While he had maintained minimal involvement in Richardson Technologies, the recordings showed that his disengagement was selective rather than complete. He paid attention to certain aspects of the company's operations while ignoring others, remaining invested in technical innovations while abandoning the leadership and strategic planning that had once excited him. "You're still the person who built that company," Sarah said. "The creativity and problem-solving abilities that made you successful haven't disappeared, but you've been applying them only to finding ways to maintain your grief, rather than to finding ways to honor Caroline's memory while still living your own life." These observations led Thomas to consider what Caroline would actually want for him. The recordings included Sarah's memories of conversations with Caroline about Thomas's well-being, insights into how his wife had viewed his relationship with work, family, and personal growth. Caroline had wanted him to have a full life, to pursue his interests and maintain connections with others, to find ways to be happy and fulfilled even if something happened to her. "She used to worry about what would happen to you if she died first," Sarah recalled. "Not because she thought you couldn't function without her, but because she knew how deeply you loved her and how that depth of feeling could become destructive if it wasn't channeled properly. She wanted you to promise that you would keep living, keep growing, keep being the person she fell in love with." Thomas remembered those conversations, promises he had made lightly because the possibility of Caroline's death had seemed remote and theoretical. Now, faced with the reality of loss, he could see how his interpretation of loyalty to her memory had violated the spirit of those promises. Caroline had wanted him to carry their love forward into continued life, not to use it as a reason to stop living. The recordings revealed another layer of complexity in Thomas's grief, his anger at Caroline for dying, an emotion so forbidden he had barely acknowledged it even to himself. Sarah had documented moments when this anger surfaced, usually during periods of intense loneliness or frustration, followed immediately by guilt and self-punishment for having such thoughts. "Anger is part of grief," Sarah said when they discussed this pattern. "Being angry at Caroline for leaving you doesn't mean you loved her less or that you're being disloyal to her memory. It means you're human, and humans get angry when people they love are taken away from them, even when that taking wasn't voluntary." This permission to feel the full range of his emotions, including the ones that seemed contradictory or inappropriate, was liberating for Thomas. The recordings had documented his tendency to police his own emotional responses, to allow only grief and longing while suppressing anything that might suggest ambivalence or complexity in his feelings about loss. As they worked through the accumulated observations in Sarah's recordings, Thomas began to understand that healing would not require him to love Caroline less or to forget the significance of their relationship. Instead, it would require him to love her in a way that honored both her memory and his own continued existence, to find ways to carry their connection forward without using it as a barrier to engagement with life. The process was not linear or easy. There were days when Thomas retreated into old patterns, when the prospect of change felt like betrayal, when the familiar pain of acute grief seemed preferable to the uncertainty of recovery. But the recordings provided a framework for understanding these setbacks as part of a larger process rather than evidence of failure or permanent stagnation. Sarah continued her documentation, but now the recordings included observations about progress as well as decline, moments of engagement alongside periods of withdrawal. She noted his increased participation in household activities, his growing willingness to discuss difficult emotions, his gradual re-engagement with aspects of his business and social life that had been abandoned. Today, Thomas spent 2 hours working on a new software problem. One recent recording noted, not because he had to, but because the challenge interested him. I could see the old spark returning, the curiosity and excitement that used to drive his innovation. It was the first time in months that I've seen him engage with something purely for the intellectual pleasure of it. These positive observations were as important as the documentation of decline had been, providing evidence that change was possible and that Thomas retained the capacity for growth and healing despite the depth of his grief. The recordings became a tool for tracking recovery, rather than just documenting deterioration, a way to recognize progress that might otherwise go unnoticed. The relationship between Thomas and Sarah had evolved into something unprecedented in either of their lives. She was no longer simply a housekeeper, and he was no longer simply an employer, but neither were they friends in any conventional sense. The recordings had created a unique intimacy based on observation, documentation, and mutual commitment to his well-being that defied easy categorization. Thomas found himself trusting Sarah's judgment about his emotional state and behavioral patterns in ways he had never trusted anyone, including Caroline. Her careful observation had earned her insights into his character and needs that were both profound and practical, creating a foundation for recovery that was built on truth rather than wishful thinking or denial. The evenings had become times for reflection and planning, conversations that ranged from immediate concerns about daily routine to broader questions about meaning and purpose. Sarah would share observations from her recordings, Thomas would offer his perspective on the behaviors she had documented, and together they would develop strategies for moving forward that honored both his grief and his need to continue living. "I think we're ready for the next step," Sarah said during one of these conversations. "You've been doing the internal work of understanding your grief, but now you need to start rebuilding connections with the world outside this house. The isolation that once protected you is now holding you back." Thomas felt both excitement and terror at the prospect of expanded engagement with life. The house had become a cocoon, a place where he could control his environment and avoid unexpected reminders of loss, but he was beginning to understand that true healing would require him to venture beyond that protection into the unpredictable world where Caroline's absence would be just one fact among many, rather than the central organizing principle of existence. The recordings had documented not just his decline and recovery, but the possibility of transformation, the potential for grief to become something other than a prison. Sarah's patient observation had created space for that transformation to begin, but the next phase would require him to test his healing in contexts that extended beyond their carefully managed conversations and controlled experiments in re-engagement. As Thomas prepared for sleep that night, returning to his study rather than attempting the master bedroom, he reflected on how profoundly the discovery of Sarah's recordings had changed his understanding of his own life. What had initially felt like a violation of privacy had become the foundation for recovery, a bridge between isolation and connection that he had been unable to build on his own. The grandfather clock chimed midnight, marking the end of another day in what was no longer an endless series of identical days but a progression towards something different, something that might eventually resemble hope. The transformation began with a simple phone call that Thomas almost didn't answer. It was Marcus Chen, his former business partner and closest friend, calling for what must have been the 15th time in 6 months. Thomas stared at the ringing device, feeling the familiar urge to let it go to voicemail, but something in Sarah's recent observations echoed in his mind. She had noted his pattern of avoiding connection precisely when connection might be most beneficial. "Marcus," Thomas said, his voice rusty from disuse in professional contexts. The surprise in Marcus's voice was evident. "Tom? Jesus, I thought I'd never actually reach you again. How are you holding up?"
Thomas found himself giving an honest answer instead of the deflective responses he had perfected over months of avoided conversations. "I'm struggling, Marcus, but I'm starting to think about not struggling so much." That conversation lasted 3 hours, the longest Thomas had spoken to anyone besides Sarah in over a year. Marcus listened as Thomas explained his isolation, his grief, and finally, hesitantly, the recordings that had forced him to confront his own deterioration. Instead of judgment or advice, Marcus offered something Thomas hadn't expected: understanding. "I've been worried about you for months," Marcus admitted. "We all have. The company's been running itself, which is a testament to what you built, but everyone's been afraid you were disappearing completely. We didn't know how to help without pushing you further away." The revelation that his colleagues and friends had been concerned, had been discussing his well-being and trying to find ways to support him, was both humbling and enlightening. Thomas had assumed his withdrawal had been barely noticed, that business had simply continued without him. Learning that people had been paying attention, had cared enough to worry and strategize about his recovery, challenged his narrative of abandonment and isolation. Marcus's call led to others. James Hartley, Thomas's former mentor, reached out after Marcus shared news of their conversation. Elena Rodriguez, the head of Richardson Technologies Research Division, sent a careful email asking if Thomas might be interested in reviewing some new developments in artificial intelligence that were revolutionizing their industry. Each contact represented a thread connecting Thomas to the professional identity he had abandoned, but also to relationships that had survived his retreat from engagement. Sarah documented these reconnections with careful attention to Thomas's responses and energy levels. She noted his increased animation when discussing technical problems, his growing interest in industry developments, his gradual return to patterns of thought and conversation that resembled his pre-grief personality. But she also tracked his emotional reactions to these interactions, watching for signs of overwhelm or retreat that might indicate he was pushing himself too hard too fast. Today Thomas spent 4 hours on a video call with the research team, one recording noted. "I could hear him laughing from the kitchen, actually laughing at something Elena said about their latest prototype." When the call ended, instead of retreating to his study, he came to find me and spent 20 minutes explaining the technical breakthrough they had achieved. It was the first time I've seen him excited about anything since Caroline's death. These professional reconnections created momentum for other changes. Thomas began venturing beyond the house for necessary errands that he had long delegated to others. Sarah accompanied him initially, providing support and encouragement as he navigated interactions with bank tellers, store clerks and other people who represented normal social engagement. The recordings captured his initial anxiety about these expeditions and his gradual comfort with routine social interactions that had once been automatic. The first major test came when Elena invited Thomas to attend a technology conference in Boston, where Richardson Technologies was presenting research that had been developed during his absence.
The invitation represented everything Thomas had been avoiding: public appearance, professional responsibility, travel that would take him away from the controlled environment of his grief-preserved home. Thomas's initial impulse was immediate refusal, but Sarah's influence had changed his decision-making process. Instead of responding reflexively, he took time to consider what Caroline would want him to do, what growth might look like, and what the cost of continued avoidance might be. The recordings had shown him that his isolation, while initially protective, had become self-perpetuating and ultimately destructive. "I think I want to go," Thomas told Sarah during one of their evening conversations. "I'm terrified, but I think that might be exactly why I need to do it." Sarah helped him prepare for the conference with the same methodical attention she had given to documenting his decline. She researched the event, helped him update his professional wardrobe, and even accompanied him to Boston to provide support during his first major public appearance since Caroline's death. Her presence wasn't intrusive but reassuring, a reminder that he had successfully built connections that could sustain him during challenging transitions. The conference exceeded Thomas's expectations and fears in equal measure. He found himself genuinely engaged with the technical presentations, excited by innovations that had emerged during his absence, and surprisingly comfortable with colleagues who treated him with warmth rather than the pity or awkwardness he had anticipated. His presentation about Richardson Technologies' future directions was well received, marking his return to professional visibility with success rather than merely survival. But the conference also triggered unexpected emotional responses. During a dinner with industry colleagues, someone mentioned Caroline's influence on technology design, her advocacy for user-centered approaches that had shaped several industry standards. Instead of the crushing grief Thomas expected, he felt pride and gratitude for Caroline's contributions, pleasure that her work continued to have impact even after her death. Sarah's recording from that evening captured a significant shift in Thomas's relationship with Caroline's memory. "He called me from Boston, excited about the conference, but also sad that Caroline wasn't there to share his excitement. But it was a different kind of sadness, one that included her as part of his experience rather than using her absence as a reason to avoid experience altogether. He said something that made me cry. I think Caroline would be proud that I'm finally living again instead of just existing in our past." The success of the Boston trip created confidence for additional risks and challenges. Thomas began visiting Richardson Technologies' offices regularly, not to resume full-time leadership but to maintain connection with the company's development and strategic direction. He accepted speaking engagements at industry events, joined advisory boards for technology startups, and gradually rebuilt a professional identity that incorporated his grief experience rather than being defined by it. These professional activities led to personal reconnections as well. Old friends who had given up on reaching Thomas during his isolation began receiving responses to their invitations and communications. He attended Marcus Chen's daughter's graduation, hosted a dinner party for colleagues at his home for the first time since Caroline's death, and even began dating, tentatively and with enormous anxiety, a software engineer named Diana Walsh, whom he met at a technology symposium. Sarah's recordings during this period of expanding social engagement captured both Thomas's growth and the challenges of his recovery. She documented his tendency to overcommit and then panic about his obligations, his struggles with survivor guilt when he enjoyed experiences Caroline would never share, and his ongoing process of learning to integrate grief with continued living. Thomas had his first panic attack in months today, one recording noted. He'd committed to 3 different professional events in the same week, plus a dinner date with Diana, and I think the prospect of so much social interaction overwhelmed him. We sat together in the kitchen while he worked through breathing exercises Caroline had taught him for managing anxiety. It reminded me that healing isn't linear, that growth includes setbacks and overwhelm as well as progress and expansion. The relationship with Diana developed slowly, with Thomas maintaining transparency about his grief and his ongoing process of recovery. Sarah observed their interactions with careful attention, noting Diana's patience with Thomas's emotional complexity and her respect for Caroline's continued importance in his life. The recordings captured Thomas's gradual comfort with the possibility of loving someone new while maintaining his connection to Caroline, a balance he had thought impossible during the depths of his isolation. Diana stayed for dinner tonight, and I watched Thomas show her Caroline's craft room, Sarah recorded. Instead of the shrine-like preservation I've seen for 2 years, the room looked lived in again. Thomas had been using it as a studio for some personal technology projects, and Caroline's art supplies were integrated with his electronic components and prototypes. He told Diana stories about Caroline's creativity and vision, but he also showed her his own creative work that was happening in that space. The room had become a bridge between past and present rather than a monument to loss. The most significant challenge during this period of recovery came when Thomas decided to sell some of Caroline's belongings. Not everything, and not carelessly, but thoughtfully choosing items that could bring joy to others, while keeping pieces that maintained his connection to her memory. The process required him to engage with their shared past in active rather than passive ways, making decisions about what to preserve and what to release based on his current needs and future hopes, rather than simply maintaining everything exactly as she had left it. Sarah supported this process with the same careful attention she had given to his initial grief, helping him sort through Caroline's things with respect for both her memory and his recovery needs. The recordings captured the emotional difficulty of these decisions, and also the liberation that came from choosing active engagement with Caroline's legacy, rather than passive preservation of her absence. We spent the morning going through Caroline's design books, one recording noted. Thomas kept the ones that represented techniques and approaches he might use in his own creative work, and donated others to the design school where Caroline had guest lectured. He said something profound: Caroline would want these books to be inspiring other designers, not gathering dust in a room no one enters. It was the first time I've seen him make a decision based on what Caroline would want rather than what his grief demanded. The donation process connected Thomas with the design school where Caroline had taught, leading to an invitation to establish a scholarship in her name that would support students developing technology solutions for social problems. The scholarship project gave Thomas a way to honor Caroline's values and vision while engaging with his own professional expertise, creating something new that grew out of their shared commitment to using technology for positive social impact. Working on the Caroline Richardson Memorial Scholarship brought Thomas into contact with students whose passion and idealism reminded him of his own early career and Caroline's enthusiasm for design that could make the world better. He began mentoring several scholarship recipients, sharing both technical knowledge and insights about maintaining personal values while building successful businesses. Sarah's recordings during this period captured Thomas's growing sense of purpose and meaning that extended beyond his personal recovery to include contribution to others' development and success. She noted his increased energy, his excitement about the students' projects, and his growing comfort with the idea that honoring Caroline's memory could include creating new relationships and experiences rather than simply preserving old ones. Thomas spent the entire afternoon with Maria Santos, one of the scholarship recipients, helping her develop a prototype for assistive technology for elderly users. Sarah recorded, "Watching him work with her reminded me of the stories Caroline used to tell about his passion for solving problems that could improve people's lives. The mentoring seems to be helping him remember who he was before grief took over his identity, while also letting him be someone new who includes Caroline's influence and his loss experience as part of who he's becoming." The scholarship project led to broader involvement with educational institutions and non-profit organizations focused on technology for social good. Thomas joined boards, funded research projects, and developed partnerships between Richardson Technologies and academic institutions that were pursuing innovations aligned with Caroline's values and vision. These activities created a professional identity that was both continuous with Thomas's pre-grief career and transformed by his experience of loss and recovery. He was no longer simply a successful entrepreneur focused on building wealth and market dominance, but someone whose business activities were guided by deeper questions about meaning, legacy, and social responsibility. Sarah's role in Thomas's life evolved as he became more independent and socially engaged. She was no longer primarily a caretaker managing his basic needs and documenting his deterioration, but a trusted advisor and friend who helped him navigate complex decisions and maintain perspective on his continued growth. The recordings shifted from crisis documentation to partnership planning, capturing their collaborative approach to supporting his ongoing development. Thomas asked me today if I would consider a different role in his life, Sarah recorded. Not housekeeper anymore, but something like a personal assistant and life consultant who could help him manage his commitments and maintain the balance he's worked so hard to achieve. It's recognition that our relationship has become something unique, that my investment in his well-being has earned me a voice in his decision-making that goes beyond domestic management.
The proposal represented a new phase in their relationship, one based on mutual respect and collaboration rather than caretaking and dependency. Sarah would continue to live on the property, but in a separate apartment that was being constructed in what had formerly been staff quarters. Her responsibilities would include managing Thomas's calendar, coordinating his various professional and philanthropic activities, and providing the kind of support that allowed him to maintain his recovery while pursuing increasingly complex personal and professional goals. The construction project itself represented Thomas's commitment to moving forward rather than remaining frozen in grief-preserved stasis. The house was being modified and updated for the first time since Caroline's death, not to erase her influence, but to accommodate the life Thomas was building that included her memory as one important element rather than the sole organizing principle. Diana's influence on these changes was significant, but carefully balanced with respect for Caroline's continued importance. She brought her own aesthetic sensibilities and practical needs to the household, but in ways that complemented rather than replaced Caroline's design vision. The recordings captured Thomas's careful navigation of this process, his attention to honoring both relationships without sacrificing either. Diana and I spent the afternoon planning modifications to the master bedroom, Thomas told Sarah during one of their evening conversations. We're keeping Caroline's favorite colors and some of her furniture, but adding elements that reflect my relationship with Diana and the person I've become since Caroline's death. It feels right to be making changes that acknowledge growth rather than just preserving the past. The bedroom renovation was completed on the second anniversary of Caroline's death, a timing that was both coincidental and symbolically appropriate. Thomas had not planned the date consciously, but when he realized the significance, he chose to see it as evidence of his readiness to move fully into a life that honored his past while embracing his present and future. Sarah's final recording in the series that had begun with documentation of crisis and despair captured the completion of Thomas's transformation from isolated griever to engaged participant in life. Her voice reflected pride in his progress and satisfaction with her own role in supporting his recovery. Today, Thomas and Diana moved into the renovated master bedroom. I watched them arranging furniture that belongs to both of them, hanging artwork that reflects their shared interests, creating a space that acknowledges Caroline's influence while celebrating their own relationship. Thomas has learned to love someone new without diminishing his love for Caroline, to build a future that includes his past without being imprisoned by it. The man I've been documenting for the past 2 years has not just survived grief, but has been transformed by it into someone more compassionate, more purposeful, and more grateful for the connections that make life meaningful. The recorder was officially retired that evening, placed in a special box alongside Caroline's original recordings about the house design and Thomas's business plans. The device that had documented the darkest period of Thomas's life became part of a collection of materials that told the complete story of loss, recovery, and transformation. Sarah's new role began the following Monday, with an office in the renovated space and responsibilities that reflected the partnership they had developed through months of careful attention to his healing process. Thomas's calendar included business meetings, philanthropic activities, time with Diana, and regular check-ins with Sarah to ensure he was maintaining the balance necessary for continued well-being. The Richardson estate no longer felt like a museum or a shrine, but like a living space where past and present coexisted comfortably. Caroline's influence was visible and honored throughout the house, but integrated with new elements that reflected Thomas's growth and his expanding relationships. The garden bloomed with Caroline's favorite flowers alongside new varieties chosen by Diana. The library contained Caroline's books as well as Thomas's expanding collection of texts on grief, recovery, and social entrepreneurship. 6 months later, Thomas stood before an audience of technology entrepreneurs at a conference about business ethics and social responsibility, delivering a keynote speech about how personal transformation could inform professional purpose. His presentation included acknowledgement of Caroline's influence on his values, gratitude for Sarah's role in his recovery, and recognition of Diana's support for his continued growth. The speech was recorded and widely shared, becoming one of the most watched presentations about grief and recovery in professional contexts. Thomas received hundreds of messages from people who had experienced similar losses, asking for advice about moving forward while maintaining connection to deceased loved ones. These communications led to Thomas's involvement in grief support organizations and his development of resources for people navigating the intersection of personal loss and professional responsibility. The Caroline Richardson Foundation, which had begun as a scholarship program, expanded to include grief counseling services, support groups for bereaved entrepreneurs, and research into workplace policies that better accommodate employees experiencing significant personal losses. Sarah's documentation had evolved from private recordings meant to track one person's decline into the foundation for programs that help thousands of people navigate similar challenges. Her careful attention to the details of grief and recovery, her insights into the process of healing, and her understanding of the balance between support and independence became resources that informed professional counseling practices and organizational policies. The recorder that had captured Thomas's darkest moments had indirectly contributed to light for countless others struggling with similar darkness. Sarah's decision to bear witness to his pain, to document his journey with care and precision, had created ripple effects that extended far beyond their individual relationship to influence broader understanding of grief, recovery, and the possibility of transformation even after devastating loss. Thomas and Diana's relationship continued to deepen, built on the foundation of his hard-won emotional health and his commitment to living fully rather than simply surviving. They married on a spring morning in the garden where Caroline's flowers bloomed alongside new plantings that reflected their shared hopes for the future. Sarah served as Thomas's best woman, a role that acknowledged her unique place in his life and her essential contribution to his capacity for love and commitment. Her speech at the reception thanked Caroline for her continued presence in Thomas's heart and welcomed Diana into a family that included both past and present, loss and love, memory and possibility. The recordings had ended, but the story they had helped create continued to unfold. Thomas Richardson had learned to live not despite his grief but through it, carrying Caroline's love forward into new relationships and experiences that honored both her memory and his own continued existence. What Sarah had documented as decline and despair had become the foundation for recovery and renewal that benefited not only Thomas but everyone whose life he touched with his hard-won wisdom about loss, healing, and the courage required to keep living even when living includes the constant presence of absence. The estate remained a place of beauty and memory, but also of active life and ongoing growth. Caroline's influence was woven into the fabric of daily existence there, but so were the influences of Sarah's care, Diana's love, and Thomas's own transformation from a man destroyed by grief into someone who had learned to let grief teach him how to love more deeply, live more purposefully, and serve others who were struggling with their own journeys through loss toward renewed engagement with life. 5 years after Thomas had first discovered Sarah's recordings, the Richardson estate hosted its annual gathering for the Caroline Richardson Foundation. The sprawling grounds were filled with scholarship recipients, their families and supporters who had contributed to what had become one of the most respected foundations for technology, education, and grief support services in the country. The event was a celebration of transformation, both personal and communal, that had grown from the seeds of one woman's careful attention to another human being's suffering. Thomas moved through the crowd with the ease of someone who had learned to navigate both professional success and personal vulnerability. At 50, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had faced his darkest moments and emerged not unscathed but strengthened by the experience. The silver in his hair had spread, and lines around his eyes spoke of both laughter and tears, but his presence commanded respect and warmth in equal measure. Diana walked beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm as they greeted foundation supporters and scholarship recipients. Their marriage had endured and deepened through the challenges of blending their lives while honoring Caroline's memory, creating a relationship that was both passionate and mature, built on the foundation of Thomas's hard-won emotional health and Diana's patient understanding of the complexities of loving someone who had loved deeply before. Sarah stood near the main tent, her role as foundation director evident in the way people sought her guidance and approval. At 67, she had evolved from housekeeper to documentarian to trusted advisor to organizational leader, each transition building on her fundamental gift for paying attention to what others needed and finding ways to provide it. Her silver hair was now completely white, but her brown eyes still held the warmth and perceptiveness that had initially motivated her to begin recording Thomas's decline. The foundation's success had surprised everyone, including its founders. What had begun as a simple scholarship program had evolved into a comprehensive support system for people navigating the intersection of personal loss and professional responsibility. The organization now provided grief counseling specifically designed for business leaders, workplace training for managers dealing with bereaved employees, and research into the economic and social costs of inadequately supported grief in professional settings. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the Foundation's research director, was presenting findings from their latest study on the impact of grief support in corporate environments. The data showed dramatic improvements in employee retention, productivity, and overall workplace satisfaction when organizations implemented the Foundation's recommended policies for supporting employees through significant personal losses. The Richardson model, as it had become known in academic and corporate circles, was based on the principle that had emerged from Sarah's recordings: healing requires both witness and agency, someone to see and document the struggle, and space for the suffering person to make active choices about their recovery process. The model had been implemented in hundreds of companies, from small startups to major corporations, creating cultural shifts that benefited not only bereaved employees but entire organizational communities. Thomas found himself in conversation with Maria Santos, now 28 and the chief technology officer of a startup developing assistive devices for elderly populations. She had been one of the first scholarship recipients, and her success represented the kind of ripple effect that had motivated the Foundation's expansion beyond simple financial support to comprehensive mentorship and community building. "I've been thinking about starting a family," Maria confided to Thomas during a quiet moment between presentations. "But I'm worried about balancing motherhood with the demands of building a company. I know you and Diana made that work, but I'm not sure I have the same support systems you had." Thomas listened carefully, remembering his own fears about major life transitions during his recovery period.
"The support systems aren't something you have," he replied. "They're something you build deliberately and carefully, with people who understand your values and commitments." Sarah taught me that healing and growth happen in relationship, not in isolation. The conversation continued as Thomas shared insights from his own experience of learning to balance personal needs with professional responsibilities, but also from the hundreds of stories he had heard through the Foundation's work. Each conversation like this reminded him of the distance he had traveled from the isolated man who had once hidden from human connection, and also of the ongoing work required to maintain the relationships that sustained both his personal well-being and his professional effectiveness. Dr. James Walsh, Diana's father and a retired professor of psychology, approached the group with his characteristic blend of academic precision and grandfatherly warmth. At 75, he had become an unexpected contributor to the Foundation's work, lending his expertise in developmental psychology to their programs for children who had lost parents and were struggling to maintain academic and social progress. Thomas Dr. Walsh said, "I've been reviewing the applications for next year's family support grants, and I'm struck by how many of them mention your keynote speech from last year's conference. The recording has been viewed over 2 million times, and we're getting applications from people who say it was the first time they understood that grief could become a source of strength rather than just a burden to bear." The speech Dr. Walsh referenced had been Thomas's most personal public presentation, delivered at the International Conference on Workplace Mental Health. He had shared the story of his own breakdown and recovery, Sarah's role in documenting and supporting his healing, and the Foundation's development as a response to the gaps he had discovered in available support for people navigating major losses while maintaining professional responsibilities. The presentation had been unscripted and unrehearsed, emerging from Thomas's recognition that his own story might provide hope and guidance for others struggling with similar challenges. The response had been overwhelming, generating thousands of emails from people who had felt isolated in their grief and grateful to hear someone speak openly about the intersection of personal loss and public life. Sarah joined the conversation, carrying a tablet that contained the day's schedule and updates from various Foundation programs. "The Grief Counseling Center in Seattle is requesting funding for expansion," she reported. "They've had a waiting list for 6 months, and the Corporate Partnerships program has generated more referrals than they can accommodate with current staffing." The success of the Foundation's programs had created what Sarah privately called good problems. Demand that exceeded resources, opportunities that required careful evaluation and strategic decision-making, growth that needed to be managed thoughtfully to maintain quality and effectiveness. Her role as director required the same attention to detail and care for individual well-being that had characterized her recordings of Thomas's recovery, but now applied to organizational development and program management. The afternoon's presentations included updates from scholarship recipients who were now working in technology companies, starting their own businesses, or pursuing advanced degrees in fields related to Caroline's original interests in human-centered design. Each success story represented not just individual achievement but validation of the Foundation's approach to supporting people through transitions and challenges that might otherwise derail their professional and personal development. Emma Chen, daughter of Thomas's former business partner Marcus, had used her scholarship to develop expertise in artificial intelligence applications for mental health support. Her presentation described a prototype system that could identify signs of depression, anxiety, and grief in workplace communications, providing early intervention recommendations that could prevent more serious mental health crises. The system is based on patterns identified in the Richardson Foundation's research, Emma explained to the audience.
We've learned that people experiencing significant grief often display predictable changes in communication style, decision-making processes, and social engagement that can be tracked and addressed before they become debilitating. The technology Emma was developing represented exactly the kind of innovation Caroline had envisioned when she advocated for human-centered design approaches. It was sophisticated and effective, but also ethical and respectful of individual privacy and autonomy. The Foundation's support had enabled Emma to pursue development work that aligned with her values, rather than simply seeking the most profitable applications for her technical skills. Thomas felt a deep satisfaction watching Emma's presentation, recognizing in her work the fulfillment of hopes he and Caroline had shared about using technology to improve human well-being, rather than just generating wealth or market advantage. The Foundation had become a vehicle for realizing those shared values in ways that honored Caroline's memory while supporting Thomas's continued growth and contribution. As the day's formal presentations concluded, the gathering moved into a more social phase, with dinner served in the main house and opportunities for informal conversation between Foundation supporters, scholarship recipients, and program participants. The atmosphere was celebratory but also intimate, reflecting the community that had developed around shared experiences of loss, recovery, and mutual support. Sarah found herself in conversation with Dr. Angela Foster, a grief counselor who had been instrumental in developing the Foundation's therapeutic programs. Dr. Foster had been intrigued by the recordings that had initiated Thomas's recovery, seeing in them a model for therapeutic documentation that could be replicated in clinical settings. "I've been working with several clients using modified versions of your recording approach," Dr. Foster said. "Not secretly, of course, but as a collaborative tool for tracking patterns and progress in ways that traditional therapy notes don't capture. The clients record their own observations about their emotional states and behaviors, then we review them together to identify patterns and develop strategies." Sarah listened with interest, pleased that her intuitive approach to supporting Thomas had contributed to professional therapeutic techniques that could help others. "The recordings forced both of us to pay attention in ways we might not have otherwise," she reflected. "Thomas couldn't dismiss his patterns when they were documented so clearly, and I couldn't ignore signs that might have indicated he was in danger." The conversation continued as they discussed the balance between observation and intervention, the importance of maintaining hope during extended periods of apparent stagnation, and the role of practical support in creating conditions where emotional healing could occur. Dr. Foster was particularly interested in Sarah's insights about the timing of confrontation and challenge, her ability to know when pushing toward change would be helpful and when patience was more appropriate. Diana approached the group, carrying plates of food for Sarah and Dr. Foster, her gesture reflecting the kind of attentiveness to others' needs that characterized the entire Foundation community. "Thomas is telling stories about Caroline to some of the new scholarship recipients," she reported with a smile. "I love watching him talk about her. It's one of the ways I know our relationship isn't a replacement for what he lost, but an addition to what he's been able to keep." The observation reflected Diana's sophisticated understanding of the dynamics of loving someone who had experienced significant loss. Rather than competing with Caroline's memory or attempting to minimize its importance, Diana had learned to see Caroline's continued presence in Thomas's life as evidence of his capacity for deep love and commitment, qualities that enhanced rather than threatened their own relationship. Dr. Foster expressed admiration for Diana's approach, noting that many people struggled with partners who maintained strong connections to deceased spouses or partners. "It requires enormous emotional maturity to support someone's grief for another relationship while building your own connection with them," she observed. Diana's response reflected years of thought and experience. "I think the key is understanding that Thomas's love for Caroline doesn't diminish his capacity to love me. If anything, it increases it, because he knows how precious and fragile love can be. The grief taught him to value connection more deeply, not less." As the evening progressed, Thomas found himself on the terrace overlooking the gardens where Caroline's favorite flowers still bloomed alongside varieties chosen by Diana and Sarah. The view encompassed both continuity and change,
preservation of meaningful elements from the past integrated with new growth that reflected ongoing life and development. Marcus Chen joined Thomas on the terrace, carrying 2 glasses of wine and the comfortable familiarity of decades of friendship. "I was thinking today about that phone call 5 years ago," Marcus said. "When you finally answered after months of my trying to reach you, I wasn't sure you were going to make it through that period." Thomas accepted the wine gratefully, appreciating both the gesture and the acknowledgement of how far he had traveled from his darkest moments. "I wasn't sure either," he admitted. "If Sarah hadn't been paying attention, hadn't been documenting what was happening to me, I might have disappeared completely without anyone really noticing until it was too late." The conversation touched on the broader implications of their experience, the recognition that successful, seemingly self-sufficient people could be particularly vulnerable to isolation during crisis periods because others assumed they were managing well independently. The Foundation's corporate programs had identified this pattern repeatedly, developing interventions specifically designed to reach people who were unlikely to seek help directly. "The recordings saved my life," Thomas continued, "but not in any dramatic way. They saved me by making it impossible to ignore what was happening, by creating accountability for my own well-being that I couldn't dismiss or rationalize away. Sarah forced me to see myself clearly, and once I could see clearly, I could start making different choices." Marcus raised his glass in a toast to Sarah, whose influence on Thomas's recovery had also preserved and strengthened their friendship and all of Thomas's other relationships that might have been lost to his retreat from engagement. The gesture acknowledged that healing is rarely accomplished in isolation, that recovery requires community and support that must often be actively maintained through difficult periods. As the evening wound down, guests began departing with expressions of gratitude for both the Foundation's work and the sense of community that had been created around shared experiences of loss and recovery. Scholarship recipients exchanged contact information with mentors and each other, creating networks of support that would extend far beyond the Foundation's direct programming. Sarah coordinated the departure process with her characteristic attention to detail, ensuring that elderly guests had transportation arrangements, that out-of-town visitors had clear directions to their accommodations, and that everyone left with materials and contact information that would maintain their connection to the Foundation community. Thomas and Diana helped with the cleanup, working alongside catering staff and volunteers to restore the estate to its usual state. The process was meditative rather than burdensome, providing transition time between the public celebration and the private reflection that would follow. Dr. Walsh lingered after most guests had departed, seeking a few minutes of private conversation with Thomas about Emma's artificial intelligence project and its potential applications in clinical settings. Their discussion evolved into broader consideration of how technology could support, rather than replace human connection during difficult periods, maintaining the balance between efficiency and empathy that characterized all of the Foundation's work. "Caroline would be amazed by what has grown from her scholarship idea," Dr. Walsh observed. "But I think she would be most proud of how you've learned to live fully while keeping her love as part of your ongoing story, rather than the end of it." The comment prompted Thomas to consider Caroline's likely response to his current life, his marriage to Diana, his relationship with Sarah, and the Foundation's development. He felt confident that Caroline would approve of his choices, not because they minimized her importance, but because they reflected the values and priorities they had shared during their marriage. As the last guests departed, and the estate settled into nighttime quiet, Thomas, Diana, and Sarah gathered in the kitchen for their traditional post-event debriefing. The conversation covered logistical details about the day's success, but also deeper reflection on the Foundation's impact and their own evolution as individuals and as a chosen family. Sarah pulled out her current recording device, a newer model than the one that had captured Thomas's darkest period, but serving a similar function of documentation and reflection. "I want to record tonight," she said, not because anyone is in crisis, but because I want to remember this moment when everything we've worked toward feels realized and sustainable. The recording that followed captured voices of 3 people who had learned to support each other through transformation and growth, who had created something meaningful from the raw material of loss and suffering, and who had discovered that healing could become a source of strength and service, rather than just personal recovery. Thomas spoke about his gratitude for Sarah's intervention during his crisis period, his appreciation for Diana's patience during his continued healing, and his wonder at the Foundation's impact on lives beyond their immediate circle. Diana reflected on the privilege of loving someone who had learned to love deeply through loss, and her pride in their shared work creating support for others navigating similar challenges. Sarah's contribution to the recording focused on the evolution of care from crisis response to community building, the satisfaction of seeing individual healing contribute to broader social change, and her own growth from domestic worker to organizational leader without losing the fundamental attention to human well-being that had motivated her original intervention. The recording concluded with silence, not the heavy quiet of depression or avoidance, but the peaceful stillness of completion and gratitude. The 3 of them sat together in the kitchen where Thomas had once struggled to eat, where Sarah had worried about his survival, where they had gradually learned to function as a family shaped by choice rather than biology or obligation. The original recorder that had documented Thomas's breakdown and recovery now resided in a place of honor in the Foundation's archive, alongside Caroline's design journals and other materials that told the story of transformation from personal tragedy to community resource. Visitors to the Foundation often requested to see the device, intrigued by its role in catalyzing such significant change. But the real legacy of Sarah's recordings was not the device itself but the principle it had demonstrated, that healing requires witness, that recovery happens in relationship, and that individual transformation can become a source of benefit for entire communities. The Foundation's work continued to expand, serving thousands of people annually, and influencing organizational policies that affected millions of workers dealing with personal crises while maintaining professional responsibilities. Thomas and Diana retired to their bedroom, the space that had once been frozen in grief, but now reflected their shared life and ongoing growth. Caroline's influence remained visible and honored, but integrated with evidence of new love, continuing creativity, and hope for the future. The room embodied the kind of healing the Foundation promoted, not forgetting or replacing what was lost, but creating space for new life alongside preserved connection to what remained precious from the past. Sarah's apartment, connected to but separate from the main house, contained her own archives of recordings, letters and photographs that documented not just Thomas's recovery, but her own transformation from employee to advocate to leader. Her story had become as much a part of the Foundation's narrative as Thomas's, demonstrating that supporting someone else's healing could become a path to discovering one's own capacity for growth and contribution. As the estate settled into sleep, the grandfather clock that had marked time during Thomas's darkest period continued its steady rhythm, but the sound no longer echoed through empty corridors. The house was alive with the presence of people who had chosen to care for each other, to pay attention to each other's needs, and to create something larger than their individual lives from the shared experience of loss, recovery, and ongoing growth. The recordings had ended, but the story they had initiated continued to unfold through the lives of scholarship recipients, program participants, and family members who had learned that grief could become a teacher rather than just a burden, that healing was possible even after devastating loss, and that individual recovery could contribute to community resilience and hope. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.